Found my girlfriend cheating on me with my close friend, I have him arrested and ghosted her. My wife Rachel and I grew up in a largish town of close to 30,000 people. We knew each other at an early age, roughly 6 or 7, can't specifically remember. We were practically inseparable. At 16, we started dating each other. When we turned 18, we moved away for work in a city just a few hours' drive away. By 20, we were married and had bought our first house. At 22, we discovered that she was pregnant with a boy. It was then disaster struck about 5 weeks before she was due to go on maternity leave. A large shelving unit collapsed and crushed her. I was told that both her and our child were killed instantly. 2 of her colleagues had also been injured in the accident, one left paralyzed, the other losing his leg after it had to be amputated. The company she was working for had, in a cost-cutting measure, decided to continue using old shelving that had been written off as unsafe instead of replacing it. I still haven't quite forgiven those executives and management personnel that made that decision, because they cut short the love of my life as well as killing our unborn child. It wasn't long after I was told I had a choice on how to proceed with what her company called compensation, but I called it blood money. They wanted to settle out of court to avoid a lawsuit. I, on the other hand, was out for their blood. Just to clarify here, this is not the revenge, this is still backstory. Fortunately, due to the coverage that it got, and involving several politicians, the case was settled quickly in court, roughly 3 years, in which the payout for all parties was close to 10 times the amount that they had initially offered. A lot of fines were given to them for breaches on work, health and safety, executives were sacked, others were jailed, etc. A story for another time maybe, when I feel comfortable sharing. In this time, I was still working my job in telecommunications. My mother, bless her soul, had moved in while all this was happening to help me. I think I would have fallen apart if she hadn't been as involved as she was. It was around this time I was offered a promotion, but it involved a lot of travel around the state. I made a request to have an office in my hometown's branch, as I wanted to not only take care of businesses in the state, but in my hometown also, as there was no business representative located there, to which they agreed. After a few months, we settled into a routine of 1 to 2 weeks in the city office, 1 week in my hometown and 1 to 2 weeks visiting the rest of the state. After a year, I decided to buy a house in my hometown, so I wasn't having to stay at my parents' place every week or so, that I was home, and that I could come and go as I pleased. This is important for later in the story. It is about 4 years later that our story begins. Sorry if the backstory was a bit long. I had just returned from one of my trips on Friday, and was checking in some stuff at my office when Harry, the branch's managing director, walked in. We had grown up together also, but had gone to different schools, but since coming back had developed a very close friendship. He asked how things were, and then asked me if I wanted to come to a house party that he was having that evening. Short notice and all, but I said yes. I felt like a few drinks with friends were in order. It was there that Harry introduced me to Catherine. She was a new hire at the branch where my hometown's office was located, and was getting to know everyone, being new in town. We hit it off immediately. As much of a cliché as it sounds, it was almost as if Rachel was in front of me, instead of Catherine. I won't bore you too much with the details, but after 2 years of dating, we decided to take the next step, and she moved into my hometown's house. Everything up to this point had been going really well. Catherine and my parents got along, and Rachel's parents also approved, and were happy that someone could make me just as happy as Rachel had done. All was going well for close to a year when things began to change. Skype sessions were cut short suddenly. Neighbors would tell me about how a car, described to me like it was Harry's, was always seen parked in the back alley near my house whenever I was away. Some clothes that weren't mine were in my wardrobe. All signs pointed to her cheating, but she said that nothing was happening. She said that Harry would come over occasionally to discuss business, etc., but never stayed the night. I chalked it up to me being paranoid and continued on as if nothing was wrong, but there was always this feeling that something wasn't right. It was close to 6 months after that I discovered that she had been lying to me. I had just finished closing a rather large contract with a new company, and negotiations had wrapped up earlier than I had anticipated. So instead of sticking around for the next few days, I decided to pay for an early flight home and surprise everyone. Fast forward a few hours and I drive into my hometown, and down the alley behind my house, so that I could get into the house without being seen and surprise Catherine. Some part of me was curious, however, as to whether this mystery car was there. Sure enough, there was a car that was blocking the back entrance gate. I was confused for a moment, wondering if it had just been a neglectful neighbor parking, only to realize that it was indeed Harry's car. If it hadn't been for the high hedge line that I had put in a few years back for privacy, I may have well driven past my own place. Pulling up behind his car, I got out and thought it was strange that he was there so late, as she claimed that he always had left by now. As I approached the back of the house, I saw something that stomach drop. In my kitchen, Catherine and Harry were going at it hammer and tong. I froze. Time stopped. There was my close friend, having sex on my kitchen bench with my girlfriend. I didn't know what to do. So many questions were running through my head. Was this real, or was I dreaming? Why were they having sex in my house? Feeling defeated, I turned and left without them seeing me. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity. I was crying hard. But the sadness quickly turned into anger. The same kind of anger I felt towards those that were responsible for Rachel's death. I wanted to hurt them badly. As a pacifist, I don't believe in violence. It was then I knew I was going to punish them and destroy their lives. And what better time to start than now? I moved my car back up the alley, far enough away from my driveway that I could still see Harry's car, and then walked back to the gate where I could see into the house, and called her phone. They were still going for it when it rang. They both looked at the caller ID and did a double take when my name came up. I could see that she was considering answering it, and they let it ring out. After a few moments they were back into it again, and I dialed once again. This time she did answered. As she was answering, I hung up and made my way back to my car. As soon as I did, she called me back. She asked why I was calling as late as I was, and I told her that I was about 10 minutes from home and didn't want to scare her coming in. She, obviously, was shocked and acted happy that I was coming, and the call ended very quickly after she said she was going to get up and get changed into something. I said bye and hung up. A few moments later, Harry came peeling through the gate and, still half naked, jumped into his car, took off like a bat out of hell. I smiled a little, knowing the fear that both of them would be feeling from being so close to being caught. I waited a few moments before turning my car into the same place Harry had been moments earlier. The night was fairly uneventful afterwards, and it wasn't until after she was asleep that I got up and went to my office down the hall. I couldn't sleep. I needed to plan. And plan I did. The revenge. My mother always taught me to be a pacifist and to allow cosmic karma to take its course. But on this occasion, I decided that karma could use a helping hand. I decided to punish them separately but destroy both of them. I knew that Harry had a drug habit. Nothing major, but he kept it very private. I only knew about it accidentally after seeing some coke, and we'd left out in his place, but pretended I hadn't seen it when he had made attempts to cover it up. I began calling some of my more unsavory clientele, and made a few discreet inquiries into obtaining some samples that they were willing to part with. A few days later, I had a decent enough stash for my plan to work. About a month later, I had friends, including Harry, around for a barbecue night. After making sure that I sufficiently liquored up Harry, I told him to stay the night and sleep it off. In the early hours of that morning, I took the drugs and an assortment of my personal belongings and placed them at various places around his car, with the biggest stash in his tire well. Confident that he wouldn't find them over the few months as the rest of my plan took effect, I locked the car up and went inside to sleep. I also placed some more drugs and personal items in his house after driving him home because he was still too drunk to drive. A few days later, I staged a break-in by smashing the back pane of my back door into my kitchen and leaving it open before heading back to the city for a flight. I had several messages the moment I landed. One from my clearly panicked mom, who had found the back door smashed open and had called the police, one from Catherine in tears, and one from the local police asking me to call. After returning all the calls, I informed the police I was away on business, and that I would be back the following week to talk with them. While I was away, I asked Catherine to stay with my parents until I returned, and my dad to arrange for a local security company to install cameras and an alarm system after getting permission from the cops. It was a typical "my God, this has happened and why would anyone do this?" routine. After thoroughly searching for my lost items and filing a police report, I had the security company rep explain to Catherine how the cameras and alarm system worked. Then the question I had been expecting. "What happens if we don't want our business recorded?" She asked the question shyly. But I knew why she asked. We were shown on the home computer how to stop recording for certain cameras, so we could protect her modesty. As I walked him out, I asked if the cameras were off, a security alert could be sent out. He returned and helped me set up email notifications before leaving. Fantastic. I just had to wait. At this point, I asked her/legal advice for advice on my country's couples law. I needed to make sure that my upcoming plan was legal, and that I wouldn't be forced to pay Catherine any money or equity because I wasn't sure if we were a de facto couple. I didn't want any nasty surprises where Catherine could take any of Rachel's estate away from me. Because we hadn't lived together long enough to be classified as de facto, and because I was paying all the utilities on the property she was living in and didn't pay rent, she had no legal standing to make a financial claim against me. But just in case, he drafted what I thought was a pretty solid legal document. Because of the success of having 3 to 5 representatives spend 1 to 2 weeks in larger surrounding towns including my hometown, my work approached me the following week and offered me a promotion to move back to the city and run the team that I was a part of. I said yes and started the 6-week process of transferring. Perfect. Enough time to collect all my evidence. After returning home the following week, I set about implementing the rest of my plan. I asked Harry for a 2-week vacation for Catherine. I wanted her and a few friends to go on a retreat before I made another life-altering decision. He jumped up and hugged me, congratulating me on being ready to jump again. I hugged him back, but not in the way he expected. He agreed and set aside the week. I asked him not to tell anyone, as I wanted it to be a big surprise. It was always going to be a wildfire in the office, but that was my plan. That night, I told Catherine I had booked her and 2 friends a week at a tropical spa resort. No questions asked, pick 2 friends and surprise her. She screamed like a child told she could have all the candy in the shop. It seemed to disappoint her that I wouldn't be home until the Monday she was leaving, but I assured her it would be worth it when she returned. In fact, I hadn't told her that I'd booked a 2-week trip to a different part of the country, mentally preparing for the shitstorm that would erupt as soon as she stepped onto the plane. 2 weeks later, I flew back and started driving home. When I arrived, I drove by my house and saw Harry's car. Like the first night, I parked far back and checked the cameras. I'm in my bed. Honestly, I wasn't surprised because I had been recording them for 2 weeks. Then I called the cops, blocking my caller ID. I told them I was worried about someone selling drugs or breaking into someone's property because I saw them in their car in the alley behind my house, occasionally passing something through windows to passing cars, while also looking into my yard. Then I described him. They said someone would be there shortly, so I thanked them and hung up. I called Catherine and told her I was about 10 minutes from home and wanted to surprise her. Looking back at the footage, I laugh at the commotion I missed. Harry was half-dressed and out the back door to his car in seconds. I couldn't have asked for a better scene. One of the police cars behind me saw Harry driving away quickly and gave chase. She fell asleep after pulling in, greeting an excited Catherine, and doing a few things. But I couldn't sleep. It was a carload the next day. After they left, I had to wait a few hours before starting my plan. I apologized for the late notice, but needed my place packed and moved by Friday. I told him he would need to take some boxes to a storage facility, which he said was no problem. Then I started packing Catherine's stuff. Later that day, the cops called to ask me to come identify some property they had seized from a suspect the night before. I smiled, pleased with my plan for Harry, and replied that I would be there shortly to collect it. The items were still missing when I arrived, presumably because they were still in his house and hadn't been searched yet. The town was abuzz with news by now. My hometown's secrets don't last long. Harry was disgraced and fired for having drugs and stolen property, and our respective bosses apologized to me in writing last week. At my parents' house that night, I told both mine and Rachel's parents what had happened, but left out certain details, and that I was moving back to the city after being promoted. In the beginning, they were displeased that I hadn't informed them, but they were pleased that I wasn't descending to their level, though they disagreed with ghosting Catherine. Afterwards, I went home. A busy week of organizing cleaners for the week, real estate to put my house on the rental market, and other tasks at my hometown's office. I packed up and drove to my parents' place to say goodbye before driving. I went to Becky's before leaving. Becky was one of Rachel's childhood friends. She was the only one who knew what was going on, minus Harry. I couldn't have done it without her help. She got a large manila folder with my evidence of her cheating, my attorney's letter, and a few other legal documents ordering her not to contact me, and directions to her stuff in the storage unit I rented out. I said my goodbyes and drove back to the city. I awoke Sunday to several missed calls, voice messages, and texts. Unaware of the town's commotion, Catherine returned home early to find an empty house and a for rent sign out front. Fearful, she ran to my parents' house, where they promptly shut the door, forcing her to call everyone until she was contacted by Becky, who said she had a package for her. I was told she didn't like it, which I knew from her angry texts and voice messages accusing me of setting up Harry, lying, etc. I was afraid she'd show up at my door, but nothing happened. After 5 weeks in a promotion, I write this for you, dear reader. My original 14-page story, double what this story is now, took a few rewrites, but I feel that most of what I said was important enough for the story. Thank you, and holy cow, this blew up. Thank you for gilding this account, even though it is a one-time use account. I am still at work and will answer any questions and provide any updates after I finish. Rev 2, now that I'm back home, I've decided to spend some time answering questions and clarifying things rather than responding to everyone. So people always ask me what happened to Harry, why I was so harsh with him, and why I would incriminate myself, especially online. Harry faces a few months in prison for his first offense, but could be out sooner, according to friends back home, so I felt it was necessary to the story. No one but me knew what I had planned for Harry, so I omitted some crucial details that could have identified me, and changed some of the descriptive language about locations to allow this story to be set anywhere in the world. If you're wondering if I'm worried about Harry finding out and reporting me to the cops, I'm not. I know Catherine has an account, but I haven't seen any recent activity from her. Who knows about other Redditors? Most of my main account's friends will recognize this story if they see it, but I can't say about their browsing habits outside of the subreddits we frequent. People have asked why I didn't do more for Catherine, or why I stayed so long. I almost kicked her out after a few days, but I wanted to gather proof of her cheating and show it to everyone she knew. I knew exposing her as a major socialite would ruin her reputation. What happened to her? I'm told she was recently transferred to another state. According to the people I spoke to today, she was mostly administrative before her transfer, due to the backlash from the rumor mill. People have questioned my actions, such as moving her stuff, sending her and friends away, and spending a lot of money on the trip. Morally, I think it's a smart move to raise her expectations of what will happen. My ultimate goal was to have her experience what it was like to have everything fall around you, along with her social status. But legally, I was in the right. She had never updated her personal information, driver's license, voter registration, etc., to reflect her move into my house. After talking to r/legal, I learned this during my pre-trial preparation with my lawyer. I was able to do what I did because I had no proof that she was living there, and we didn't have de facto status. And finally, for those of you who are accusing me of being a karma whore, a sociopath, who doesn't have some sociopathic tendencies nowadays, and citing my malicious compliance story as proof, I will be honest and say I won't try to change your minds. Everyone has a right to an opinion on stories shared on Reddit and those who share them. My original post on r/pro required me to build up enough karma before they would allow me to post because they suspected I was a bot. That story, which I only edited in because I can't remember it all, happened and was soon covered nationally. It was or was close to one of the largest roaming bills our company had ever passed on to a customer. I'll keep you informed if anything changes.